Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
It was Mother's Day, and there I sat in my creaky old rocker on the porch of my little house in suburban Ohio, the kind of place where the neighbors still wave, but everyone knows your business anyway. When my millionaire son David pulled up in that shiny black SUV that probably cost more than my house, his smile wide as the driveway, but his eyes scanning like he was appraising a stock tip. And he leaned in close after hugging me stiffly and said those words that hit like a cold splash, Mom. Are you happy with the $7,000 Clara sends you every month? I paused, feeling that familiar knot in my stomach tighten, and replied quietly, Son, the church is keeping me alive these days, watching his perfect grin fade like fog in the morning sun, and right then, his elegant wife Clara walked in. Her heels clicking like Judgment Day, carrying a bouquet that screamed store-bought obligation, and I wondered if this visit was about love or just tying up loose ends from a past none of us wanted to dig up. I remember that morning like it was yesterday, the sun peeking through the blinds in my modest living room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air and the stack of unopened mail on the side table, bills mostly. The kind that pile up when you're on a fixed income in a town like Dayton where the cost of living creeps up but wages don't. My name is Evelyn Harper, 68 years young, or so I tell myself on days like this, widowed for 15 years after Harold's heart gave out too soon, leaving me to rattle around in this two-bedroom bungalow with its squeaky floors and wallpaper peeling at the edges from years of Ohio humidity. The house isn't much, but it's mine, paid off with Harold's life insurance and my savings from waitressing at the local diner until my knees said enough. David's call 2 days prior had caught me off guard. He rarely phones without a reason, and announcing their visit felt more like a courtesy than excitement. His voice clipped as always, mentioning something about a layover on their way to a conference in Chicago. I spent the evening before dusting and vacuuming, even though they wouldn't notice, and baking a batch of oatmeal cookies because that's what mothers do, prepare even when the guests bring their own world with them. The SUV arrived right on time, 10 sharp, gravel crunching under the tires like bones underfoot, and I stepped out in my best floral dress, the one I save for church Sundays, smoothing my graying hair and pasting on a smile that hid the butterflies in my gut. David emerged first, all 6 feet of him in khakis and a button-down that screamed casual Friday at the office, his hair still dark but styled with that expensive gel. Looking every inch the real estate tycoon who'd turned our family's modest dreams into a multi-million-dollar empire down in Atlanta. He gave me one of those quick hugs, the kind that pats your back twice and pulls away, his cologne sharp and overpowering the fresh-cut grass smell from mowing the lawn myself last week. Happy Mother's Day, Mom, he said, his grin flashing white teeth, but his eyes flicked to the house, assessing the sagging porch rail like it was a fixer-upper on his list. Clara followed, stepping out with the grace of someone who practices it, her blonde bob perfect, wearing a silk blouse and slacks in soft beige, carrying that bouquet of lilies wrapped in plastic from some airport florist. She's been his wife for 12 years now, met her at one of his business mixers, and while she's always polite, there's a coolness to her, like she's sizing up the room for exits. Evelyn, you look wonderful, she said, handing me the flowers with a smile that didn't crinkle her eyes, and I thanked her, inhaling the heavy scent that masked cheaper store-bought stems. We headed inside, the screen door slapping shut behind us, and settled in the living room on the worn couch and armchairs, the ones Harold and I picked out from a garage sale back in the 80s. I offered iced tea from the pitcher in the fridge, the glasses sweating in the May warmth, and David launched right into his updates, talking about flipping condos in hot markets, his hands gesturing big as if I could visualize the profits. I nodded, sipping slowly, feeling the gap between our worlds widen with every word, him in penthouses, me pinching pennies for the electric bill. That's when he asked it, leaning forward with that earnest look he uses to close deals. Mom, are you happy with the $7,000 Clara sends you every month? It's steady, right? Covers everything. The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through me. 7,000 sounded generous. Sure, enough for groceries, meds, and the occasional utility spike, but it was wired like clockwork, impersonal, from an account in Clara's name, and it never touched the loneliness that echoed in empty rooms. I set my glass down, the ice clinking softly, and paused, meeting his eyes. "Son, the church is keeping me alive these days." His smile faltered, the confidence slipping as he glanced at Clara, who had been quietly admiring a photo of him as a kid on the mantel, all gap-toothed and muddy from backyard adventures. She turned then, refilling my tea with a fluid motion, but her gaze lingered, probing. "The church? That's wonderful, Evelyn. Community is so important." Her tone was light, but I caught the edge, wondering if she knew more than she let on about why I leaned on St. Mary's these days, the food pantry runs, the prayer groups that filled the voids David's calls couldn't. The afternoon dragged with small talk, David boasting about a new development, Clara chiming in about their travels, and me sharing bits about the garden out back, the tomatoes just starting to ripen. But underneath, tension simmered, like the pot roast I had in the oven for lunch. When David mentioned how busy they were, I couldn't resist a little poke, smiling as I said, "Sounds like you're running the world, David. Just remember, it all started with me packing your lunches, so you could focus on those big dreams." He chuckled, but it was forced, cheeks tinting pink, and Clara's lips thinned, a small win, that witty reminder of who laid the foundation, satisfying the quiet resentment I'd nursed like a secret recipe. Lunch was simple, tuna melts on rye because extravagance isn't my style, eaten at the kitchen table with the radio humming soft country tunes in the background. David complimented the food, but his mind seemed elsewhere, picking at his plate while Clara steered conversation to neutral ground, asking about my health checkups. I mentioned the church's senior program, how it got me out and about, dropping a hint about Father Michael's visits that made David's brow furrow. As we cleared dishes, the phone rang from the wall unit, shrill and insistent, and I excused myself to answer, heart picking up when I heard Father Michael's voice, urgent about some old matter from Harold's time at the mill. Something about records that could stir up dust long settled. I kept my responses low, but as I hung up, I caught David's eyes on me from the doorway, curious and a touch suspicious, the air thickening with questions he hadn't yet voiced, leaving me to wonder if this visit would unearth more than just family photos. That suspicious look in David's eyes as I hung up the phone stayed with me like a shadow lengthening across the kitchen floor in the late afternoon sun. His posture rigid in the doorway with arms crossed over his chest, as if bracing for bad news from one of his board meetings, while Clara busied herself wiping down the counter with a dish towel she had grabbed from the drawer. Her movements precise and efficient in a way that suggested she was more accustomed to directing staff than pitching in on domestic chores, and I could sense the undercurrent of curiosity turning to unease in the air between us. Thick as the steam rising from the teakettle I had just set to boil for a fresh round of drinks to ease the growing tension that had simmered since their arrival earlier that day on this Mother's Day that was supposed to be about simple joys, but felt more like peeling back layers of an old wound neither of them wanted exposed. I turned to face him with what I hoped was a casual smile, mentioning offhand that it was just Father Michael checking on the church bake sale preparations for next weekend, the one where volunteers like me spend hours kneading dough and swapping stories about grandchildren who never call, but David's brow remained furrowed, his voice probing as he asked if everything was all right because the call had seemed urgent, and I deflected with a light laugh, saying that urgency in a small town like ours usually meant someone forgot to bring the sugar or the hymnals were out of order, though inwardly I replayed Father Michael's words about those mill records potentially resurfacing, documents that could link back to the early days of David's career when ambition blinded him to the human cost of his first big break. A time when I had sacrificed my own dreams of opening a little flower shop to cover his law school loans after Harold's death left our finances in tatters. We migrated back to the living room as the kettle whistled, carrying our mugs of chamomile tea that Clara complimented for its soothing quality despite the store-brand bags I used to stretch the budget, and settled into a conversation that naturally drifted toward the past, because that's what happens when family gathers in a house filled with mementos. The faded photographs on the walls whispering reminders of simpler times when David was just a lanky teenager tinkering with model homes in the garage, dreaming aloud about turning rundown properties into gold while I worked overtime at the diner flipping burgers and pouring coffee for truckers who tipped in quarters. Every extra shift a silent investment in the son who promised to make it all worth it someday, promises that materialized in his success, but evaporated when it came to the emotional dividends I had banked on. Like visits that went beyond holidays or calls that delved deeper than surface updates on stock portfolios. David steered the talk to the old mill by the river, that sprawling brick complex on the edge of Dayton where Harold had spent 30 years operating machinery that stamped out auto parts for the big Detroit factories, boasting now about how he had acquired the site 5 years back through a savvy negotiation with the bankruptcy court, transforming the rusting relic into luxury lofts with exposed beams and waterfront balconies that fetched top dollar from young professionals fleeing the city hustle. His enthusiasm genuine as he described the revenue streams and tax breaks, but I listened with a mix of pride and that familiar ache, recalling the layoffs that hit like a tidal wave back in the 90s when the industry shifted south. Harold clinging to his job until the end while I sewed patches on David's jeans and skipped my own dental checkups to fund his extracurriculars, the very foundation that launched him toward those boardrooms without a backward glance when the real struggles mounted. After the accident, Clara interjected smoothly during a pause, her elegant fingers cradling the mug as she explained how the $7,000 she wired each month originated from her personal accounts, a gesture she initiated after reviewing David's family history during their early courtship, discovering through old letters the extent of the hardships I had weathered alone, and there was a subtle twist in her confession, a hint of guilt coloring her words as if the payment served not just as support but as a quiet atonement for marrying into a legacy built on overlooked sacrifices, her controlling nature emerging in the way she detailed the automatic setup with the bank, ensuring it arrived promptly on the first without fail, almost as if she were managing a business obligation rather than a familial one, and I wondered if her poise masked a deeper awareness of the mill's tangled history. Perhaps even the church's role in quietly advocating for families like mine who lost loved ones to corner-cutting decisions in the name of profit. As the afternoon light slanted golden through the windows, casting warm glows on the threadbare rug, I felt the moment ripe for a touch of revenge, that clever nudge to remind David of forgotten promises without raising my voice above a conversational tone. So when he waxed poetic about the mill's revitalization bringing jobs back to the community, I smiled wryly and remarked that it was heartening to hear, especially after all those years I scrimped to send him to college so he could turn dreams into reality, though I still waited on that callback about helping with the garden fence he swore he'd fix last summer, the sly comment landing with the precision of a well-aimed dart as his laughter came out strained and Clara's eyes widened slightly, exposing the crack in his armor of self-assurance and satisfying the quiet fury that had built over years of one-sided generosity. The conversation flowed onward from there, weaving through memories of family vacations to the lake where David learned to fish under Harold's patient guidance, trips funded by my side gigs cleaning houses on weekends while Clara shared polished anecdotes from their life in Atlanta, mentioning charity galas and networking events that kept their calendar full, her tone implying a world where time was a commodity too precious for spontaneous drives north to check on an aging mother, and I dropped subtle clues about the church's deeper involvement, casually noting how their benevolence fund had covered unexpected repairs after a storm last fall, funds that overlapped curiously with the timing of Clara's first transfer, planting seeds of intrigue that made David shift uncomfortably on the couch. We stepped out to the backyard as the sun dipped lower, the air filled with the earthy scent of turned soil from my small vegetable patch where rows of beans and carrots pushed through the dirt. Like resilient hopes, and David confided in a rare vulnerable moment about the pressures of maintaining his empire, admitting Clara's steady hand kept him from crumbling under investor demands. But his words trailed off when I mentioned the mill workers from our church who had approached Father Michael recently about old pension disputes, whispers of unresolved grievances that tied back to the acquisition. The evening approached with a soft breeze rustling the leaves, and just as I prepared to invite them in for an early dinner to extend the fragile connection, Clara paused by the garden gate, her phone silenced in her pocket, but before she could speak, she overheard my murmured aside to David about the church's latest prayer vigil for forgotten laborers, the words carrying on the wind straight to her ears, causing her to freeze with a sharp intake of breath while David's face darkened, the unspoken implications hanging heavy and propelling us toward revelations none of us could ignore any longer. Clara's sharp intake of breath by the garden gate hung in the cooling evening air like a held-back storm cloud as we all stood there in the backyard, the rustle of leaves from the old maple tree overhead amplifying the sudden silence that followed my murmured words about the church's prayer vigil for forgotten laborers. Her face paling under the fading light while David turned to me with a stare that mixed confusion and a dawning irritation, his hands clenching at his sides as if gripping an invisible briefcase full of defenses he hadn't yet unpacked, and I realized in that moment how my casual aside had struck a nerve. Bridging the gap between polite family chatter and the raw underbelly of histories we had all danced around for years in this modest Ohio suburb where secrets simmered beneath the surface like the pot roast I could smell bubbling from the kitchen window, calling us back inside before the tension boiled over into something irreparable on what was meant to be a day of maternal celebration, but felt increasingly like a reckoning long overdue. I suggested we head in for dinner with a practicality born from years of hosting potlucks and holiday meals where timing was everything to keep peace among prickly relatives, leading the way through the screen door that slapped shut behind us, the familiar creak of the floorboards underfoot grounding me as Clara trailed silently and David muttered something about needing a moment to check emails, though I suspected it was more about composing himself after overhearing whispers that hinted at judgments from beyond our family circle, the kind that could tarnish the polished image he had built brick by lucrative brick. We gathered around the dining table in the heart of the house, the one Harold had sanded and varnished himself from reclaimed wood scavenged from the mill's scrapyard during lean times. Now draped with a checkered cloth I ironed that morning and set with my everyday china, the patterns chipped from decades of use but holding stories in every flaw, like the time David as a toddler flung a spoon across the room in a fit over peas, leaving a permanent dent that we laughed about until the laughter faded with the years. The pot roast emerged steaming from the oven, tender beef surrounded by carrots and potatoes glazed in the juices, accompanied by a green salad tossed with dressing from a bottle because fresh herbs were a luxury I saved for church events, and fresh rolls warmed in foil that Clara eyed with polite curiosity, her usual aversion to carbs evident in the way she portioned sparingly, while David dug in with the appetite of his younger self, complimenting the flavors with a nod. That eased the air fractionally as we passed the platter and filled glasses with water from the pitcher, forgoing wine since no one seemed in the mood for loosening tongues just yet. Conversation started safely enough, circling back to neighborhood updates like Mrs. Jenkins' new hip surgery and the community's push for better streetlights after a string of petty thefts, but as the meal progressed and plates emptied, the weight of the backyard exchange pressed in, David setting his fork down midway through his second helping to ask directly about that prayer vigil I had mentioned, his tone casual, but laced with an edge that demanded clarification, probing whether it was just routine church business or something tied to old mill grudges that folks still nurse like sore thumbs, and I felt the dilemma coil in my gut, the choice between spilling the full tale of his abandonment in the wake of Harold's accident, those months when I juggled grief, bills, and a part-time job at the library, while he chased internships in the city without so much as a weekend visit, or holding back the key details that would force him to confront how his rise came at the expense of my unraveling. A withholding that might frustrate those around the table, but empowered me to control the narrative on my terms. Clara jumped in supportively, her fork pausing as she recounted how she had learned about the church's programs through David's sporadic updates, explaining the $7,000 as her way of bridging gaps that schedules left wide open. But her words carried a subtle twist, revealing how she had pushed for the amount after auditing their joint finances and seeing echoes of my sacrifices in the spreadsheets, almost as if the transfers were her calculated intervention in a family dynamic. She viewed from the outside like a consultant spotting inefficiencies, and I appreciated the intent even as it stung that it took an outsider's ledger to prompt what blood ties hadn't. The dinner wore on with the clink of silverware and the hum of the overhead fan stirring the savory aromas, and as dessert approached, a humble apple crisp baked with fruit from the community orchard where church volunteers gathered each fall. I sensed the ripe moment for revenge, that witty exposure of hypocrisies. Without descending into outright accusation, so when David boasted about mentoring young entrepreneurs through his foundation, drawing parallels to his own bootstrap story, I leaned in with a mischievous glint and, accidentally, let slip the family lore about his high school escapade where he sold fake stock tips to classmates during a mock market project, pocketing lunch money until the principal called me in for a conference, chuckling that it was his first lesson in ethics, though clearly some deals still blurred the lines, the tale landing with perfect timing as David's fork froze midair and Clara suppressed a genuine laugh that broke the ice momentarily. His embarrassment flushing his neck while satisfying my need to highlight the patterns without a direct hit, a clever payback that left him deflecting with excuses about youthful folly and her intrigued by the vulnerability it exposed. The crisp circulated warm and cinnamon-scented, spoons scraping bowls as the clock on the wall ticked toward 8, shadows stretching across the room from the setting sun filtering through lace curtains. And the conversation deepened inevitably toward the heart of the conflicts, David circling back with more insistence about the church's hold on my life, implying that the money should eliminate any need for such dependencies and questioning why I clung to it like a lifeline when his success could provide more if asked, his words igniting the growing uncertainty that had shadowed the day, forcing me to navigate the impending confrontation over the betrayal of his absence during my darkest hours after the mill accident, when the church's casseroles and counseling sessions were the only constants while he wired excuses from afar. Coffee followed in mismatched mugs, the bitter brew a fitting chaser to the sweet dessert, and just as the caffeine sharpened our edges, David leaned forward. Across the table, his voice dropping to an insistent murmur that cut through the post-meal haze, demanding full answers about what exactly the church had done to keep me alive that his family's contributions apparently couldn't touch. His eyes boring into mine with a mix of concern and accusation that pinned me in place, the question hanging unresolved as Clara's gaze flicked between us, the air electric with the promise of truths teetering on the brink, ready to topple the fragile balance of this Mother's Day dinner into uncharted territory. David's insistent murmur demanding answers about the church's role in keeping me alive sliced through the lingering aroma of coffee and apple crisp like a knife through the last remnants of civility at our dining table. His eyes locked on mine with that unyielding focus he probably reserved for high-stakes negotiations in Atlanta's gleaming skyscrapers, while Clara sat poised beside him, her fingers drumming lightly on the tablecloth in a rhythm that betrayed her composed facade. The post-dinner haze from the meal we had just shared now thickening with the uncertainty of truths hovering just out of reach, and I felt the weight of the dilemma settle heavier on my shoulders. The choice between allying with Clara's subtle overtures of understanding or isolating myself further by doling out revelations in measured doses that would force David to earn every scrap of the past he had long ignored. All of this unfolding in the warm glow of the kitchen light that cast long shadows across the faces of the family I had raised and the woman who had woven herself into it, turning what started as a Mother's Day visit into a tense unraveling of loyalties and hidden motives on this ordinary evening in my Ohio home where the walls held echoes of laughter long faded. I met David's gaze steadily, buying time by suggesting we move to the living room for comfort away from the cooling dishes, rising slowly with the creak of my chair to lead them through the archway. The grandfather clock in the hall chiming 9 as if marking the hour when pretenses often cracked, and Clara followed close, her hand brushing my arm in a gesture that felt almost conspiratorial, whispering as David trailed behind that she had sensed this undercurrent for years and wanted to help Bridget if I would let her, a hint of alliance forming in her words that complicated my resolve to navigate this alone, especially as she alluded to discovering discrepancies in old financials tied to the mill that might explain the church's quiet compensations beyond what David knew. We settled into the armchairs around the coffee table cluttered with the photo album from earlier, the air still carrying the faint vanilla scent from the crisp, and I began weaving the story carefully. Starting with the immediate aftermath of Harold's accident at the mill. Not the heart attack David always referenced in passing, but the machinery failure during an overtime shift when cost-cutting measures, pushed by emerging developers like the firm David consulted for fresh out of school, had skipped routine inspections, leading to the collapse that trapped Harold and two others, a tragedy the company hushed with settlements funneled through the church to avoid lawsuits that could have derailed budding careers, including the one that propelled my son to his current heights of luxury and detachment. David's face hardened as I spoke, interjecting defenses about how he was just starting out and unaware of the full scope, claiming any involvement was peripheral at best, but Clara's expression shifted with a twist of revelation, admitting under my probing gaze that the $7,000 had originated from her review of inherited assets, specifically a small family trust Harold set up from mill bonuses that David had overlooked in his early deals, using it as leverage for the property acquisition without realizing it siphoned from my future security. Her confession laced with the guilt of a partner who had prioritized empire building over ethical audits until the numbers didn't add up during their last tax filing. The room grew quieter, the tick of the clock amplifying the growing conflict as alliances flickered, Clara leaning toward me with offers to adjust the payments directly from that trust, while David paced the rug, his agitation building like a storm front, accusing the church of meddling in affairs long closed and me of harboring grudges that poisoned the day, forcing me into the dilemma of whether to expose more about Father Michael's envelope of records that could validate claims of negligence or hold back to preserve a sliver of family unity, a choice that left me isolated in my knowledge yet empowered by the control it afforded over the impending revenge simmering beneath my calm exterior. As the tension peaked with David's voice rising in frustration over perceived exaggerations from bitter old workers, I sensed the perfect opening for my witty sabotage, reaching into the sideboard drawer for the small velvet pouch containing Harold's pocket knife. The one with the bone handle worn smooth from years of use on fishing trips and mill breaks, its blade nicked from the day it saved a coworker's hand during a close call, and handing it to David with a nostalgic smile, suggesting he examine the inscription inside the handle for the man who cuts through the BS engraved by me on their anniversary, adding lightly that it had served Harold well in spotting sharp deals from dull ones. Though apparently some edges got overlooked in the rush to fortune, the double entendre landing with humorous precision as David's grip tightened on the knife and Clara bit her lip to stifle a chuckle. His ego deflated in that moment of shared memento that highlighted his oversights without a direct assault, a satisfying revenge that diffused the air momentarily while deepening the cracks in his confidence. We lingered there, the knife passed back and forth like a talisman of unresolved debts, and Clara opened up further about her own regrets, revealing how she had initiated the transfers not just from guilt but to safeguard against potential audits that could link the mill sale to hidden liabilities, dropping subtle clues about church documents that corroborated the trust's misappropriation. Her words shifting the dynamic as she positioned herself as a reluctant ally in rectifying the imbalances. Though I remained wary, choosing isolation over full trust to maintain my leverage in this web of familial entanglements. The night deepened outside, stars pricking the sky visible through the window, and David, exhausted from the emotional skirmish, proposed they take the guest room upstairs for the night to continue discussions fresh in the morning, a suggestion Clara endorsed, with a nod that masked her calculations, but as I showed them to the spare bed with its quilt handmade by church ladies during my recovery, the house settling with familiar groans, a firm knock echoed from the front door, startling us all in the hallway. And I approached cautiously, peering through the curtain to see the unmistakable figure of Elder Thompson from St. Mary's standing on the porch under the dim bulb, his coat clutched tight against the chill and a thick folder under his arm, his arrival unannounced and laden with the promise of further revelations that could either forge uneasy alliances or shatter the night's fragile truces forever. Elder Thompson's firm knock reverberated through the quiet hallway like a final judgment call in the dead of night, pulling me from the threshold of the guest room where David and Clara stood frozen in their robes. The fabric rumpled from hasty dressing as the chill from the open front door carried whispers of rain-scented wind into the house, his silhouette framed by the porch light revealing a man in his 70s with wire-rimmed glasses and a wool overcoat clutched tight. The thick folder under his arm bulging with papers that promised to either illuminate the shadows of our family's past or cast new ones longer and darker, and I felt the pulse of uncertainty quicken in my veins. This unannounced visit from the church elder thrusting the Mother's Day tensions into overdrive as David's voice cut sharp from behind me, demanding to know who would show up at such an hour, while Clara's eyes widened with a mix of apprehension and curiosity, her hand instinctively reaching for David's arm in a bid to steady the brewing storm that had simmered all day in my modest Ohio bungalow, now poised to erupt with revelations that could redefine loyalties and expose the fragile foundations of success built on overlooked sacrifices. I ushered Elder Thompson inside with a hushed urgency, closing the door against the encroaching night and leading our impromptu gathering to the living room where the embers of the earlier fire in the grate still glowed faintly. Offering mugs of instant coffee from the kitchen pot that tasted more like regret than refreshment, the steam curling up to mingle with the musty scent of old books on the shelves as we arranged ourselves in a tense circle, me on the couch, David pacing the rug, Clara perched on the armchair's edge, and Thompson settling into Harold's old recliner with a weary sigh that spoke of burdens carried for decades on behalf of grieving widows and displaced workers. He wasted no time, sliding the folder across the coffee table with hands steady from years of delivering somber news at funerals and fundraisers, explaining in his gravelly voice how the church archives had yielded these documents during a routine digitization project, copies of union reports, insurance claims, and a sealed letter from Harold's shift supervisor detailing the mill accident not as a simple malfunction, but as a preventable catastrophe stemming from deferred maintenance to boost quarterly profits, measures advocated in memos from consultants tied to David's fledgling firm right after he graduated. A twist that positioned my son's early ambition as an unwitting catalyst in the chain of events that widowed me and upended lives across the community. The church stepping in as mediator to secure confidential settlements that included ongoing stipends for families like mine, funneled discreetly to preserve reputations and avoid the scandal of public hearings that could have halted budding real estate ventures in their tracks. David's face strained of color as Thompson outlined the timeline, dates aligning perilously with his first contract wins and the trust fund Harold had quietly amassed from overtime bonuses intended as my nest egg, which surfaced in the papers as partially redirected during the mill's bankruptcy sale, a revelation that Clara absorbed with a sharp intake, her composure cracking as she confessed the full motive behind the $7,000, admitting it was her way of repaying from their joint assets after uncovering the discrepancies in a private investigation prompted by anonymous tips from former mill contacts. Not pure altruism, but a calculated hedge against potential claims that could unravel David's empire if the church ever went public. Her elegant poise fracturing into vulnerability that humanized her in my eyes even as it highlighted the light vulgarity of laundering guilt through bank wires rather than face-to-face amends. The room fell into a heavy silence broken only by the clock's relentless ticking, the folder's contents splayed open like a dissected heart exposing veins of betrayal and complicity, and David erupted in denial, his voice rising to protest the narrative as biased recollections from sore losers clinging to outdated grievances, insisting his role was advisory at most and that the settlements were fair resolutions long settled. But the evidence mounted in faded ink and notarized signatures, forcing him to confront how his oversight in those heady post-college days had cost more than dollars. It had eroded the trust between mother and son, leaving me to lean on the church's prayer chains and community drives while he jetted off to closings and celebrations, a dilemma that now pinned him in place as Clara reached across to squeeze my hand, offering to formalize the payments from the reclaimed trust portions without David's input if needed, her alliance solidifying in the face of his defensiveness, and creating rifts that made me question if my years of withholding full truths had isolated me needlessly or wisely preserved my dignity in the face of indifference. Emotions swirled thick in the air, frustration at David's entitlement clashing with a reluctant empathy for Clara's position, and the audience within me them, but also the lingering spirit of Harold. Grappled with my choices to nurture this slow-burn revenge rather than seek early reconciliation, decisions that prolonged the pain but now delivered a cathartic edge as I chose my final payback with deliberate wit. Retrieving the wooden box from the mantel that held Harold's cracked pocket watch. The one stopped at the hour of his accident, but symbolic of time's unforgiving march, and presenting it to David with a wry smile, quipping that it might finally tick again if wound with a bit of honesty instead of excuses. The clever jab underscoring how some mechanisms jammed from neglect could be freed with the right acknowledgement, watching his shoulders slump in defeat while Clara's lips curved in quiet approval, the satisfying sting of exposure landing without venom, but with enough humor to lighten the blow. Even as I withheld the watch's hidden compartment containing Harold's unsent letter of forgiveness, a personal absolution I kept private to maintain the ambiguity of whether healing was possible or if pride's price was eternal echo. Elder Thompson gathered the papers as dawn's first light crept through the curtains, gray and tentative like the uncertain future unfolding, advising discretion to protect all involved while hinting at the church's ongoing role as guardian of these truths. And David, subdued now, mumbled apologies laced with promises of deeper involvement, perhaps restructuring support or even a family retreat to mend fences. But Clara's parting embrace felt more genuine, her whisper of continued wires, regardless of outcomes suggesting fractures in their union that the night had widened. They loaded into the SUV as the sun rose, taillights fading down the Dukas driveway, leaving me on the porch with the box in hand and the folder's weight in my lap, the church bells tolling softly in the distance to signal morning service. And I pondered the lingering questions that no revelation could fully answer. Would the money flow as atonement or dry up in resentment? Could bonds reforged from rubble hold against ambition's pull, or had my revenges merely traded one form of isolation for another, the ambiguity settling like morning mist, thought-provoking and unresolved, inviting reflection on the quiet strengths that sustain us when family falters and faith fills the voids left behind.